All right, so today we're going to be looking at some pretty interesting material and maybe a little unsettling for some folks.
Yeah.
We're talking about what could happen if Trump wins a second term.
Right.
Specifically, how the EU is getting ready for a potential trade war with the U.S.
Okay.
So the source material we have for this is excerpts from an online video and a transcript of that video, and they focus on EU-U.S. trade relations reactions to Trump possibly coming back into office and some of the new trade agreements that the EU has been working on.
I see.
So have you ever thought about tequila shots getting more expensive because of political drama?
That's a new one.
That's just a taste of what we're diving into.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I think you bring up a good point about the impact this could have on everyday life.
Right.
Because it's easy to just think of this as political noise.
Yeah.
But the EU is dealing with some pretty serious economic issues already.
Right.
And the possibility of Trump, reimposing tariffs is just adding another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation.
Yeah. It's like adding fuel to a fire that's already burning pretty intensely.
Exactly.
So we've got the energy crisis going on in the EU, fueled by the war in Ukraine.
Of course.
And, Qatar and Azerbaijan are halting gas exports.
Right.
And then on top of that, you add the U.S. sanctions against Russian oil and gas. It's just a lot.
It really shows how much the EU depends on other countries for their energy.
Right.
And moving away from using Russian gas is not a simple thing.
Yeah.
It's not just flipping a switch.
Yeah.
It takes time to find new suppliers. And they might even have to invest in new infrastructure, which is expensive.
Yeah.
And takes time.
And all of that ends up costing the everyday person, which of course contributes to inflation,
Right.
which then leads to discontent and instability,
Absolutely.
which then plays right into the hands of those populist movements and that anti-EU sentiment that's out there.
Creates a vicious cycle. Economic problems cause political instability.
Right.
Which then makes it harder to fix those economic problems in the first place.
And then, as if that weren't enough, the EU has to deal with the possibility of Trump coming back.
Oh, yeah.
And he's never been quiet about his willingness to use tariffs as a tool in trade negotiations.
No, he has not.
Remember the tariffs on steel and aluminum from his first term?
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
Those are a good example of how these trade wars can actually play out.
Yeah.
They were designed to protect U.S. steel and aluminum producers by making imports from other countries more expensive.
Of course.
But that's only one side of the coin.
Right.
It also raised prices for European businesses that need those materials.
Of course.
Which contributed to inflation in the EU.
Exactly.
Which then caused the EU to retaliate with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Right, like those tariffs on bourbon motorcycles and jeans.
Yeah, those classic American products.
Seems like they chose those products very carefully. To hurt industries and states that are important for U.S. elections.
It was a calculated move for sure.
It showed that the EU wasn't going to back down without a fight.
And it just shows how interconnected global trade really is.
Yeah.
These decisions have consequences that affect industries and consumers and even politics on both sides of the Atlantic.
It's a big web.
So knowing all of this, it's understandable why the EU is a little worried about a potential second Trump presidency.
Yeah.
And the possibility of more tariffs.
Of course.
They're trying to find ways to protect themselves.
Makes sense.
One way they're doing this is by trying to depend less on the U.S. market.
Right. Diversifying.
Exactly. Diversification is key.
They're actively pursuing new trade partnerships.
And they've already got a pretty significant agreement with Mexico.
Yes, they do.
Which is interesting because Mexico is right next door to the U.S.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a coincidence?
I think it's strategic.
Okay.
This agreement gets rid of tariffs on a lot of EU exports, including important agricultural products.
Like what?
Like cheese, wine, and chocolate.
Oh, so things that people really care about.
Exactly. Things that people buy every day.
Yeah.
This helps EU agricultural exports.
Okay.
But it also increases their presence in the North American market.
So they have other options besides the U.S.
Exactly.
It's almost like they're saying, hey, U.S., we don't need you. We've got other friends.
Right.
And they're not stopping there.
No, they are not.
The EU is also working on a deal with the Mercosur bloc.
Oh, wow.
Which is a group of South American countries. And this potential free trade area is huge.
Yeah.
Over 700 million people and 25% of the global GDP.
Yeah, it's a huge opportunity for the EU.
And a clear sign that they're looking to expand their global influence.
Absolutely.
But the Mercosur deal is facing some opposition within the EU.
Really?
Especially from agricultural groups who are worried about competition from cheaper South American products.
That makes sense.
It shows how difficult it is to balance economic opportunities with domestic concerns.
That's always a balancing act.
It's a good reminder that trade deals aren't simple.
Yeah.
There are always winners and losers.
Right.
And figuring all of that out is part of the game.
It's part of the process.
To really understand how important all of this is, I think it helps to look at the history of the EU-US relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So how would you describe that relationship?
Well, it's been an interesting mix of cooperation and competition.
Okay.
After World War II, the U.S. was really important in helping Europe rebuild through the Marshall Plan. This created a strong partnership based on shared values and the goal of stopping the Soviet Union from expanding during the Cold War.
The Marshall Plan is a great example of international cooperation.
It really is.
It really shaped the world after the war.
It absolutely did.
But as Europe got back on its feet economically and started to want a more independent role in the world, we saw some tensions start to emerge.
Right.
A good example of this is the Suez Crisis in 1956, where the U.S. opposed British and French intervention in Egypt.
It showed that their interests didn't always align.
Yeah.
Even though they were allies.
Exactly. And then there's the Berlin Crisis of 1961.
Right.
Which reminds us how fragile the peace was during the Cold War.
Absolutely.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union were so close to nuclear war.
This scary thought.
The Berlin Crisis also shows how important NATO has been.
Yes.
It showed the U.S. commitment to keeping Europe safe.
Right.
And providing the military power to stop the Soviet Union from attacking.
Exactly.
But even though NATO was this unifying force, the relationship between the EU and the U.S. still had its ups and downs.
It did.
The Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s caused a lot of friction.
Right.
Many European countries criticized the U.S. involvement in the war. And there were disagreements about economics, too.
Of course.
Especially about currency policies and trade practices. Those disagreements often turned into trade disputes.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what we're talking about today.
It set the stage for the trade tensions we see now.
So it seems like the EU and the U.S. are always doing this kind of dance.
Yeah.
They need each other, but they also constantly challenge each other.
It's a complicated relationship.
It's a relationship built on shared interests, but also weighed down by history and this constant competition for global power.
That's a great way to put it.
So looking at the big picture, what could happen if this trade war actually starts?
Yeah.
Who's going to be hurt the most?
Well, it's important to understand that trade wars hurt everyone involved.
Right.
But the impact won't be the same for everyone.
Right.
The U.S. is a big investor in the EU, and it provides a security umbrella through NATO.
Yeah.
But the EU depends more on trade with the U.S.
Okay.
So disrupting that trade could really hurt the European economy.
And we've already seen how quickly things can escalate.
Right.
The steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018 were a wake-up call.
They were.
And now the EU is getting ready for round 2.
It seems like they're always on the defensive.
It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah.
Especially with all the other challenges they're facing.
Right. And we can't forget about the tension over digital taxes.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And the EU's efforts to regulate those big U.S. tech companies.
That's a whole other layer of complexity in this relationship.
It is.
And it's something that affects a lot of our listeners directly.
I imagine so.
Considering how much those tech companies are a part of our lives.
They're everywhere.
It's really a clash of philosophies.
Yeah.
The EU is all about data privacy
Right.
and wants to regulate these tech giants to protect its citizens. But the U.S. sees this as an attack on American companies and their global dominance.
So it's a debate about digital sovereignty, corporate power, and the future of the internet.
So we've got the energy crisis, potential trade wars, and this fight over digital taxes.
It's a lot.
It paints a pretty complex and concerning picture of the future of the relationship between the EU and the U.S.
It does.
Is this the beginning of the end for this partnership?
It's hard to say.
Or can they find a way through all of this?
That's the million-dollar question.
To answer that, we need to look at some possible scenarios for how this relationship could change.
That's a good next step. You know, before we jump into those scenarios, I think it's important to remember that this tension between the EU and the U.S. isn't just about economics and politics.
Right. We touched on the digital tax issue, but you mentioned something about the EU trying to create their own tech champions. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. The EU has started to realize that being a leader in technology is really important for economic and geopolitical power. They've seen how powerful the U.S. tech giants have become.
Right.
And they don't want to be too reliant on them.
So are they basically trying to make their own Google and Amazon?
Yeah, no, it's not that simple. It's not just about copying what already exists.
Right.
The EU is focusing on specific areas. Like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and green technologies.
Okay.
They're putting a lot of money into research and development. And they're offering incentives to startups to encourage innovation.
Okay.
And they're creating regulations that help domestic tech companies grow.
But catching up to the U.S. in those areas seems really difficult.
It won't be easy, that's for sure. But the EU has some advantages.
Okay.
They have a large and skilled workforce and a strong foundation in scientific research.
Okay.
And they have the benefit of being a single market.
Right.
Which means businesses can grow quickly.
And they're not afraid to use regulation to shape the tech world.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to that issue of regulation, which seems to be a big point of friction between the EU and the U.S.
It is.
Especially when it comes to digital taxes and data privacy.
Right.
The EU seems much more willing to regulate big tech, while the U.S. prefers a more hands-off approach.
It's a difference in values and priorities.
Okay.
The EU cares a lot about data privacy and protecting consumers. But the U.S. prioritizes innovation and a free market.
So this clash of values shows up in things like antitrust laws, content moderation, and digital taxes.
Exactly.
It seems like the EU is becoming a major force in regulation.
It does.
And they might even set the global standard for how tech is governed.
Possible.
Could this lead to a more fragmented internet?
It could.
With different rules and regulations in different parts of the world.
It's already happening in some ways.
Like where?
Countries like China and Russia.
Okay.
They're also trying to control the internet more.
Right.
This fragmentation could have a big impact on how we communicate, how we do business, and even how we think about freedom of expression online.
That's a lot to consider.
It is.
But let's bring it back to our listeners for a second. Why should they care about this potential trade war?
That's a great question.
And these changes in the relationship between the EU and the U.S.?
I think people should care because it affects their lives in many ways.
Okay, how so?
Well, trade tensions can impact the entire global economy, affecting things like the price of goods and services, job security, and even investment opportunities.
So things that people experience every day?
Exactly.
Like I'm already imagining my morning coffee getting more expensive.
That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
Tariffs on imported goods often lead to higher prices for consumers.
Right.
And trade disputes can also disrupt supply chains.
Yeah.
Leading to shortages of certain products.
And this isn't just about things we buy in the store?
No, it's not.
These tensions could also affect big industries and investment decisions.
Absolutely.
A trade war could make it harder for businesses to operate across borders.
Yeah.
Which could lead to less investment, job losses,
and slower economic growth.
So this isn't just some abstract political argument.
No, it's not.
It could actually affect our wallets, our jobs, and even the future of technology.
You got it.
It shows how interconnected the global economy really is.
It does.
Things that happen in Brussels and Washington don't just stay there.
Right.
They have ripple effects all over the world.
It's a globalized world.
It makes you realize how important it is to stay informed about these issues.
It is.
And to understand the things that are shaping our world.
Knowledge is power.
Speaking of shaping our world, let's zoom out even further and think about what these transatlantic tensions mean for the global balance of power.
That's a big question.
It is.
If the EU becomes less reliant on the U.S., it could lead to a world where power is distributed more evenly.
You mean a multipolar world?
Exactly.
That sounds kind of unpredictable.
It does.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It's complicated.
Okay.
On the one hand, it could lead to more instability and competition between different countries.
Yeah, like because they're all vying for influence.
Exactly. We might even see more regional conflicts as alliances shift and old rivalries come back.
It's like a geopolitical game of risk.
That's a good analogy.
But on the other hand, A multipolar world could also lead to new alliances.
It could.
Collaborations, and it could create a more balanced global order where no single country is in charge.
That's right.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
It is.
With both risks and potential benefits.
Yeah, the outcome depends on how the major players act.
It really emphasizes the importance of diplomacy.
It does.
Cooperation, and a commitment to working together to solve global problems.
Absolutely.
If the major powers can find common ground and work together, then a multipolar world could be a good thing.
It could be.
But if they focus on rivalry and conflict,
the
consequences could be pretty bad.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
The future isn't set in stone. Our choices today will shape the world of tomorrow.
Okay, so we've explored the potential fallout of this trade war, from the economic impact to the changes in technology to the bigger geopolitical picture.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But let's be honest.
Okay.
This is all pretty heavy stuff.
It is.
Is there any reason to be optimistic?
I think so.
Okay, what are the silver linings here?
Well, sometimes a crisis can actually lead to positive change.
Okay.
This situation could force both the EU and the US to look at their weaknesses and rethink their priorities.
Okay.
It could lead to a global economy that's more sustainable and resilient, one that's less reliant on a single superpower.
I like that perspective.
Yeah.
Turning a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth.
Exactly.
It's good to hear some optimism.
It's important to remember that the future isn't fixed.
Right.
We have many paths we can take. And the choices we make today will determine which path we follow.
So what are the big decisions that need to be made?
Well, who are the key players in this geopolitical game? On the EU side, it's important to think about the internal dynamics within the bloc.
Okay.
Can they overcome their differences and work together?
Right.
Are they willing to make tough choices to become more independent?
And what about the U.S.?
Yeah.
What role will they play in this new world order?
Well, the U.S. is still the most powerful country in the world.
Right.
But their influence is decreasing. They have a big decision to make.
Okay.
Do they accept a multipolar world?
Right.
Or do they try to hold on to their fading dominance?
It's a crossroads moment.
It is.
Not just for the EU and the U.S., but for the whole world.
The decisions made in the next few years will affect generations to come.
And it's not just about governments making decisions.
Right.
Individuals have a role to play too.
Absolutely.
By staying informed, engaging in constructive dialogue, and advocating for the kind of world we want.
Right. We can all help shape a better future.
It's a reminder that we're not just bystanders.
Right.
We can make a difference.
Even in the face of these challenges.
Exactly. Every action counts.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a lot in this episode.
We have.
We've looked at what could happen if there's a trade war between the EU and the US. We've analyzed how power is shifting in the world.
Yeah.
And we've even talked about what the future might hold.
It's been a deep dive.
But now I think it's time to bring it back down to earth.
Okay.
And talk about what all this means for our listeners.
I agree. Let's connect these big ideas to everyday life.
So if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by all this talk of trade wars, geopolitics, here's what you need to remember.
Okay.
First, stay informed.
Read reliable news sources, follow experts on social media, and talk about these issues with others.
The more you understand, the better you can navigate this complex world.
Yeah. Second, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
Challenge assumptions, look for different perspectives, and don't settle for easy answers.
Critical thinking is so important these days.
Especially with so much information out there.
It's overwhelming.
And finally, remember that you have a voice.
You do.
Speak up about the issues that matter to you.
Yeah.
Talk to your elected officials.
Right.
And support organizations that are working to make the world a better place.
Even small actions can make a difference.
That's right.
We all have a part to play in shaping the future.
And by working together, we can create a world that's fairer, more prosperous, and more peaceful.
I love that.
It's a good reminder that even when things feel uncertain and complicated, we can still make a positive impact.
We can.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
What's the question?
What if this potential trade war, with all its challenges and uncertainties, is actually an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
An opportunity to rethink our economic systems, to strengthen our communities, and to build a world that's more resilient, more equitable, and more sustainable.
That's a good one.
Something to ponder.
Yeah, lots to think about.
As we head into the final part of this episode.
We'll be back in a moment with the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Where we'll explore some potential solutions.
Sounds good.
And offer some practical advice for navigating this uncertain future.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
We've spent the last 2 parts talking about this pretty intense scenario of a potential trade war between the EU and the US.
Right. If Trump wins a second term.
Exactly. And it's easy to get caught up in all the doom and gloom.
It is.
But we always want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope.
Well, of course we want them to feel empowered.
Exactly. So in this final part, let's focus on what can be done.
Right. What are the solutions?
We've talked about the EU finding new trade partners and strengthening their tech sector. Those are good steps, but they take time.
They do. Those are long-term strategies.
So what about right now?
Yeah.
What about this immediate threat of a trade war?
Right.
How can the EU and the US avoid that?
Well, I think diplomacy is key.
Okay.
Open and honest communication is essential.
Right.
To address concerns and find common ground, and to prevent things from escalating.
So basically you need to talk to each other.
Yeah, and they need to be willing to compromise.
Okay.
And look beyond their own immediate interests.
See the bigger picture?
Exactly.
That sounds good in theory.
It does.
But it's probably a lot harder in practice.
It is.
Especially when you consider all the political maneuvering and the strong personalities involved.
It's definitely a challenge.
But history shows us that even the toughest conflicts can be resolved through diplomacy.
That's true.
It takes patience, persistence, and a real effort to understand the other side. And this isn't just about governments negotiating.
Yeah, it's not.
Businesses and organizations.
Right.
And even individual citizens can play a role in fostering dialogue and building bridges.
People-to-people exchanges are so important.
Right. Like cultural programs and educational initiatives.
Those can really help.
Yeah, when people from different cultures connect, it helps break down stereotypes and build trust.
It's like that saying, travel is fatal to prejudice.
I like that.
The more we interact with people who are different from us,
the
more we realize how much we have in common.
Oh, okay. So diplomacy and people-to-people connections are important.
They are.
But are there any specific policies that could help?
To de-escalate tensions and prevent a trade war.
Yeah.
I think one solution is to focus on shared goals.
Okay.
For example, both the EU and the US want to address climate change.
Right.
And promote global health security and combat terrorism. Working together on these challenges can build trust.
It's about finding common ground.
Exactly, even when they disagree on other things.
So instead of focusing on what divides them,
right,
they can focus on what unites them.
Exactly.
What about reforming the World Trade Organization?
That's another good idea.
Does that help?
I think so. A reformed WTO could help level the playing field.
Okay.
And resolve trade disputes more fairly. And discourage protectionist measures.
Right, because those hurt everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It's about creating a set of rules that everyone agrees to follow.
So we've got diplomacy, people-to-people connections, cooperation on shared challenges, and WTO reform.
Those are all good ideas.
They are, but how do we actually make them happen?
It seems like a lot.
Yeah, it feels a bit overwhelming.
Change takes time.
Right.
But it starts with individuals taking action.
Okay, what can individuals do?
Stay informed.
Right.
Engage in constructive dialogue. And advocate for the kind of world they want to live in.
So use our voices. Express our concerns and hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly.
And support organizations that are working to make a difference.
Right.
It's about remembering that we're not just passive observers.
We're not.
We can actually influence what happens.
What can shape the future?
That's a good reminder.
It is.
So if you had to sum all of this up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
The world is complex.
Yeah.
And things are constantly changing.
But even with all the uncertainty and challenges, there's always hope.
There is.
We have the power to shape the future.
We do.
And by working together, we can create a world that's more equitable and more sustainable.
That's what we should strive for.
That's a great message to end on.
Yeah, I think so.
A reminder that even when things seem impossible, we can still make a difference.
We can.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We appreciate you.
We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
We hope it sparks some good conversations.
Stay curious, stay engaged,
Right.
and most importantly, stay hopeful.
Absolutely.